The sun hadn't cleared the ridge when Martha Fielding found the first body. She'd been hauling water from the creek, same as every morning, when her bucket slipped from her hands and clattered against stone. The sound echoed through the canyon in a way that made her skin crawl. That's when she saw him. One of Pike's men, sprawled across a boulder with his eyes still open, staring at nothing. A single bullet hole punched clean through his chest. Martha dropped the bucket and ran. By noon, Sheriff Ethan Boone had counted 5 corpses scattered through Miller's Canyon like broken dolls. Each one killed the same way. Single shot, center mass. No wasted bullets, no panic fire, no mercy. The kind of shooting that came from something colder than anger. Standing in that canyon with the wind howling between stone walls, Boone felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years of wearing a badge. Genuine fear. "Who the hell could do this?" Deputy Sam Porter whispered, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Boone didn't answer. He couldn't, because the only men he'd ever known capable of this kind of precision had been military scouts and frontier sharpshooters, the kind who'd disappeared after the territorial wars ended, the kind everyone assumed were dead. The valley descended into chaos within hours. Merchants shuttered their shops early. Families locked their doors before sunset. Ranchers armed themselves and watched the horizon like hawks. The death of Pike Mercer's gang should have brought relief. Instead, it brought terror. Because if someone could kill Pike's crew this easily, what chance did ordinary people have? In the saloon that night, speculation ran wild. "Had to be military," Tom Henderson said, nursing his third whiskey. "Regular folk can't shoot like that." "Maybe it was Pike's own men," another voice suggested. "Turned on each other. In a perfect line through the canyon? All at once?" Henderson shook his head. "Nah, this was something else, something worse." Nobody mentioned Caleb Hale, the quiet rancher who lived 3 miles east of town, alone except for 2 horses and a mean-tempered rooster. The man who came into town once a month for supplies, paid in cash, and never said more than 5 words to anyone. Why would they? Caleb was just the grieving widower, the broken shell of a man who'd lost everything and barely held himself together. People pitied him. Some of the church women left food on his porch. Kids avoided his property because his silence felt wrong somehow, like a house after a funeral. Nobody feared him. That was their first mistake. Bossa. 3 days before the Canyon Massacre, Pike Mercer rode into the valley with 12 men at his back. Pike was everything the frontier bred when civilization turned its head, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of smile that made decent people check their wallets. He'd built his reputation on 2 principles: take what you want and kill anyone who objects. For 5 years, he'd terrorized settlements from Colorado to New Mexico, always moving, never staying long enough for the law to catch up. But something had changed. "We're setting up here," Pike announced to his men as they surveyed the valley from the northern ridge. "This land's got water, timber, and enough isolated ranches that nobody'll organize against us." His second-in-command, a scarred nightmare named Dutch Carver, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "What about the law?" Pike laughed. "You see that town? 300 people, 1 old sheriff, and a deputy who looks like he'd piss himself in a gunfight. We'll own this valley in a month." They started with the Morgan Ranch. Samuel Morgan was 63 years old, arthritis in both hands, with a wife and 2 grown daughters who helped run the cattle operation. When Pike's gang rode up to his door, Morgan tried to be reasonable. "I don't want trouble," he said, standing on his porch with his hands visible. "You boys need supplies. I can spare some." Pike shot him in the leg. Mrs. Morgan's scream cut through the afternoon air as her husband collapsed. Pike dismounted slowly, deliberately, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. "Here's how this works, old man," Pike said, crouching beside Morgan. "You've got 3 days to pack up and clear out. This ranch? It's mine now. You object, and I'll burn it down with your family inside. We clear?" Morgan, tears streaming down his face from the pain, nodded. Pike stood, brushed dirt from his pants, and rode away whistling. Word spread fast. By sunset, everyone in the valley knew Pike Mercer had claimed his first property. By midnight, 3 families had already started packing. By dawn, Sheriff Boone found himself facing a line of terrified ranchers demanding he do something. "There's 12 of them," Boone said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can't." "Then get a posse together," someone shouted. "And who's volunteering?" Boone shot back. The crowd went silent. "That's what I thought." The truth settled over them like winter frost. They were on their own. Pike spent the next 2 days consolidating power. He took the Morgan Ranch and immediately moved on to the Williams property, then the Chen family farm. Each time the message was identical: leave or die. Most left. The few who resisted learned quickly what resistance cost. On the third day, Pike turned his attention east, toward Caleb Hale's ranch. Caleb was fixing fence posts when he first saw the riders, 12 men on horseback, moving in a tight formation across the valley floor, dust trailing behind them like a funeral shroud. Caleb set down his hammer and watched them approach, his face expressionless. He knew exactly who they were. He'd heard the stories, knew about the Morgan Ranch, about the families fleeing in the night. Part of him had wondered when they'd come for him. Another part, the part he'd buried years ago, had been waiting. Pike reined up 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to talk, far enough to draw if necessary. Professional distance, the kind outlaws learned early or died young. "You Caleb Hale?" Pike called out. Caleb nodded once. "I'm Pike Mercer. This here's my territory now." Pike let that hang in the air. "You got 2 choices. Pack up and leave, or sell me this property for whatever I decide it's worth." Caleb stood there in his worn work shirt and dusty pants, a hammer hanging from his belt, looking like the least threatening man in the territory. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "No." The word landed like a stone in still water. Pike's smile faded. "What?" "I said no." Caleb's expression didn't change. "This is my land. I'm staying." Dutch Carver laughed, a harsh bark of amusement. "Boss, you hearing this? Old man thinks he can—" "I heard him," Pike said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. He studied Caleb with new interest. "You know who I am?" "I know." "You know what I've done?" "I know." Pike leaned forward in his saddle. "Then you're either brave or stupid. Which is it?" Caleb didn't answer, just stood there, waiting, his hands loose at his sides. The silence stretched out until Pike finally shook his head and smiled again, that charming smile that never reached his eyes. "Tell you what," Pike said, "I respect a man with backbone, so I'm going to give you until tomorrow morning to change your mind. Think about it. Think about what happened to the Morgans, what happened to the Williams family." He turned his horse. "One way or another, this land's going to be mine." As the gang rode away, Dutch looked back over his shoulder. "You think he'll run?" "Doesn't matter," Pike said. "If he's still here tomorrow, we burn him out. Either way, we get the land." What none of them noticed, what nobody in the valley had ever noticed, was the way Caleb's eyes tracked them as they left. Not with fear, not with resignation, with calculation. The kind of calculation that came from years of hunting men. Caleb waited until full dark before he moved. He walked out to his barn, past the 2 horses who nickered softly at his approach, past the tools and supplies that marked a simple rancher's life. In the back corner, beneath loose floorboards worn smooth by weather and time, his fingers found the iron chest. It was smaller than most people would expect, 2 feet by 3 feet, heavy as sin, secured with a lock that hadn't been opened in 12 years. Caleb carried it into the cabin and set it on the table. For a long moment he just stared at it. In the lamplight he could see rust around the edges, dust in the crevices. He'd buried this chest the same day he buried his wife. Swore he'd never open it again. Swore he was done with killing. His hand trembled as he reached for the key hidden in his pocket. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the silent cabin. Caleb lifted the lid slowly, and there it was, wrapped in oiled cloth, exactly as he'd left it. The Sharp's buffalo rifle. 50 caliber, 40-inch barrel, custom sights he'd modified himself. The weapon that had made his reputation on the frontier. Beneath the rifle lay other things. A leather pouch of specialized cartridges. A scope wrapped in velvet. And at the bottom, a medal he'd been awarded for service during the territorial campaigns, back when he'd been Sergeant Caleb Hale, the best long-range scout the Frontier Army ever produced. Back when men whispered his name with respect and fear. Caleb ran his hand along the rifle barrel. The metal was cold, familiar, like greeting an old friend you'd hoped never to see again. Memories flooded back, targets at 800 yards, 900, once a confirmed kill at over 1,000 yards in high wind. Shots other men said were impossible. He'd proven them wrong every time. But that was before Sarah. Before he'd met the woman who made him want something beyond killing. Before she'd given him a reason to walk away from the violence, to build a life instead of taking them. Before the fever took her and left him alone with nothing but grief and a promise he'd made at her grave. Never again, he'd sworn. I'm done. For 12 years, he'd kept that promise. Caleb looked out the window toward where Pike and his men had ridden. Thought about the Morgan family, about the Williams, about all the people who'd suffer if Pike stayed. Then he thought about his barn full of hay and wood, his horses, the simple life he'd built from the ashes of his past. He closed his eyes, made his choice, and began loading cartridges. Pike and his men returned at dawn exactly as promised. They came loud and careless, whooping and laughing like they were headed to a celebration instead of an eviction. Dutch carried a torch. 2 others had ropes ready. They'd done this before, and it always went the same way. Threaten, burn, take. Simple as Sunday. "Hale!" Pike shouted as they approached the cabin. "Your time's up. You coming out, or we dragging you out?" The door opened slowly. Caleb stepped onto the porch, wearing the same worn clothes as yesterday, looking tired and old in the morning light. His hands were empty, visible, surrendering. Pike grinned. "Smart man. Now pack your—" "I need you to understand something," Caleb said quietly. "What's that?" "I gave you a chance to leave. You didn't take it." Pike's grin widened. "That a threat, old man?" "No." Caleb's voice was perfectly calm. "It's an explanation." Something in his tone made Dutch reach for his pistol, but he was too slow, too confident, too used to victims who froze or begged. Caleb wasn't a victim. He was 40 feet from the nearest rider when he moved, not back into the cabin. That's what they'd expect. Instead, he dropped off the side of the porch and rolled, coming up behind the water trough as the first shots rang out. Wood splintered, water sprayed, bullets punched through the trough and whined off the ground. But Caleb wasn't there anymore. He'd already moved again, this time toward the barn, using the horses and terrain exactly the way he'd planned the night before. Every step deliberate, every movement calculated. He wasn't running from them. He was leading them. "Get him!" Pike roared. "Dutch, circle around. Don't let him reach." The barn doors crashed open. Caleb emerged with his Sharps rifle in his hands, and for just a second, every man in that gang saw something that made them hesitate. Not the rifle. Plenty of ranchers owned rifles. It was the way Caleb held it, the way he moved, like the weapon was part of him, like he'd been born holding it. The first shot caught Dutch Carver in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse before anyone could react. The massive .50 caliber round punched through him like he was made of paper. The second shot missed, Caleb's fault, overcompensated for the wind, but it came close enough to Pike's head that he heard the bullet pass. That's when Pike understood. This wasn't a rancher defending his home. This was something else entirely. "Fall back!" Pike screamed, wheeling his horse. "Fall back!" The gang scattered like quail, confused and suddenly terrified. They'd been expecting a victim. Instead, they'd found a predator. Caleb didn't pursue. Just stood there in the morning light, the massive rifle still smoking in his hands, watching them run. When the dust settled and the hoofbeats faded, Dutch Carver lay bleeding in the dirt, clutching his shattered shoulder and whimpering. Caleb walked over slowly, the rifle pointed down but ready. "Please," Dutch gasped, "please, don't—" "Where's Pike taking you?" "What?" Caleb's voice remained quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Your gang. Where do they hole up?" I don't—" Caleb raised the rifle slightly. "Miller's Canyon," Dutch blurted. "The old mining camp in Miller's Canyon. We got supplies there, bedrolls, everything." Caleb nodded. Then he looked toward the cabin. His cabin. The one Pike had come to take. The one Sarah had loved. The one he'd sworn to protect. It was burning. While he'd been fighting in the front, one of Pike's men had circled around and lit it anyway. Flames were already consuming the roof, licking at the walls. Everything he'd built. Everything he had left. Gone. Dutch saw Caleb's expression change and started crawling backward. That wasn't me. I didn't know they were gonna—" "Where in the canyon?" Caleb's voice hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had. The north end, where it narrows. There's caves, shelter from the wind. Caleb studied him for a long moment. Dutch was bleeding badly, probably wouldn't make it without help. Probably didn't deserve help. Part of Caleb, the old part, the part that remembered what men like Dutch did to innocent people, wanted to leave him there to die slow. But Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. You're better than them. That's why you stopped. Caleb lowered the rifle. There's a doctor in town, he said. Crawl if you have to. He turned and walked back toward his burning cabin, toward everything he was losing for the second time in his life. Behind him, Dutch Carver dragged himself toward the road, leaving a trail of blood in the dust. Inside the cabin, Caleb managed to save almost nothing. A few tools, some clothes, the photograph of Sarah, miraculously untouched in its metal frame. He stood there as the roof collapsed, as years of carefully built peace crumbled into ash and ember, and somewhere deep inside, something that had been sleeping for 12 years woke up completely. The quiet rancher was gone. The ghost of the frontier had returned. By sunset, Sheriff Boone had heard about the confrontation at the Hale ranch. The story came in pieces. Dutch Carver stumbling into town half dead, Pike and his gang riding hard toward Miller's Canyon, witnesses who'd heard the gunfire and seen the smoke. Boone sat in his office, trying to make sense of it all. Caleb Hale, he said aloud, testing the name. Quiet Caleb Hale put a .50 caliber round through Dutch Carver's shoulder. Deputy Porter shook his head. Must have got lucky. Panic shot. Maybe. But Boone didn't think so. He'd seen enough gunfights to know the difference between luck and skill. And Dutch's wound, clean entry, clean exit, precisely placed to disable without killing, that wasn't luck. That was expertise. Boone pulled out his record books and started digging. Hale had moved to the valley 12 years ago, paid cash for his land, never caused trouble. Before that? Nothing. No records, no history, like he'd appeared from nowhere, which meant he'd probably been somebody else before. What are you thinking? Porter asked. I'm thinking, Boone said slowly, that maybe we don't know Caleb Hale at all. He sent a telegraph to the Territorial Records Office requesting any military service documents for a Caleb Hale, approximate age 50, possibly served in the frontier campaigns. It was a long shot, but Boone had learned to trust his instincts. While he waited for a response, Pike Mercer was having his own realization. The gang had gathered in the caves at the north end of Miller's Canyon, exactly where Dutch had said they'd be. The mood was ugly. They'd lost Dutch, their best tracker and meanest fighter, to an old rancher with one rifle. It was embarrassing. Worse, it was dangerous. We going back? One of the younger men asked. Pike stared into the fire. Yeah, we're going back. Boss, maybe we should just... I said we're going back, Pike's voice cracked like a whip. You think I'm letting some old man make me look like a fool? You think I'm running from this? But even as he said it, Pike felt something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. That shot. That perfect, precise shot that took Dutch out of action without killing him. The way Hale had moved, the complete lack of fear in his eyes. Pike had seen that look before. On military snipers. On the kind of men who'd been trained to kill from distances most couldn't imagine. Who the hell is this guy? He muttered. Nobody had an answer. Caleb spent that night preparing. He'd watched the gang flee toward Miller's Canyon just as he knew they would. Only one good shelter in that direction, and men like Pike always chose comfort over strategy. They'd hole up, lick their wounds, convince themselves they were safe. They were wrong. Caleb laid out his equipment on the ground. The Sharps rifle, 40 rounds of ammunition, a scope, field glasses, a canteen, dried meat, and a worn leather journal he hadn't looked at in years. The journal contained notes from his army days, wind calculations, distance estimates, elevation adjustments, the mathematics of death. He opened it slowly. The pages were yellow with age, covered in his own neat handwriting. Calculations for shots he'd made, targets he'd eliminated, all recorded with clinical precision. On the last page, written in different ink, was a single line. I'm done. For Sarah. Caleb ran his finger over the words. Then he picked up a pencil and added below. I'm sorry. He closed the journal and checked his rifle. The weapon was old but maintained perfectly. Despite 12 years in a buried chest, every mechanism worked smoothly. Muscle memory took over as he broke it down, cleaned each piece, and reassembled it with practiced ease. 3 miles away, in Miller's Canyon, Pike's gang settled in for the night. They posted 2 guards and rotated them in shifts. Smart, professional, the kind of security that kept gangs alive on the frontier. But they were guarding against normal threats, not against someone like Caleb. He left his burned ranch before dawn, moving through the darkness with the same efficiency he'd learned 30 years ago. Every step silent, every motion deliberate. He knew this valley better than anyone, every ridge, every creek bed, every game trail that offered cover. By the time the sun rose, Caleb was in position on the high ground overlooking Miller's Canyon, invisible among the rocks and scrub brush. Below, Pike's camp was just waking up. Men stumbling out of bedrolls, starting fires, heating coffee, living their last hours without knowing it. Caleb set up his rifle and pulled out the scope. At this distance, roughly 600 yards, the wind would be the biggest factor. He wet his finger and held it up, feeling the breeze. Southwest, maybe 8 miles per hour, gusting to 12. He made adjustments, checked the elevation, controlled his breathing, and waited. The old skills came back like they'd never left. The patience, the absolute stillness, the ability to become part of the landscape, invisible and immovable. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Below, Pike's gang went about their morning routine, completely unaware they were being watched. Caleb wasn't in any hurry. Rush, and you miss. Miss, and you die. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, long ago. Around mid-morning, one of the gang members, a tall, thin man with a scar across his face, separated from the group. Walking toward the canyon wall to relieve himself, his back to the camp, alone, vulnerable. Caleb had a clean shot. He exhaled slowly, let his heartbeat settle, and squeezed the trigger with the same gentle pressure he'd used 1,000 times before. The shot echoed through the canyon like thunder. The man dropped instantly, dead before he hit the ground. And just like that, the war began. Chaos erupted in the camp. Men dove for cover, scrambling for weapons, shouting questions nobody could answer. The echo made it impossible to locate the shooter. The canyon walls bounced the sound everywhere and nowhere. Pike stood in the center of camp, his pistol drawn, spinning in circles. "Where is he? Where is he?" Another shot rang out. Another man fell. "North Ridge!" someone screamed. "He's on the north." Ooh. A third shot proved that guess wrong. This one came from a completely different angle, or seemed to. The acoustics in Miller's Canyon were notorious, distorting sound in ways that made directional tracking nearly impossible. Caleb had chosen his position specifically for that reason. He worked methodically, picking targets with cold precision. Not the fastest shooter, not trying to panic them into mistakes, just steady, deliberate elimination. Each shot placed exactly where it needed to be. By noon, 5 men were dead. The survivors huddled behind rocks, behind their horses, behind anything that offered protection. Fear had replaced confidence. These were hardened outlaws who'd murdered, robbed, and terrorized their way across 3 territories. But none of them had ever faced this. They were being hunted. Pike crouched behind a boulder, his expensive suit covered in dust, his hands shaking. "We can't stay here," he hissed to his nephew, a young kid named Jake who'd joined the gang 6 months ago. "We're trapped." "Where do we go?" Jake's voice cracked with terror. "He's got us pinned." "Then we split up. Move fast. He can't shoot us all at once." It was reasonable thinking, sound tactics, exactly what Caleb expected them to try. When 3 men finally made a break for it, running in different directions, using the terrain for cover, Caleb didn't even try to shoot them. He let them go, watched them disappear into the canyon network, because the real target was still there, Pike Mercer himself. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Sheriff Boone received a telegraph response. The message was brief but explosive. Caleb Hale, Sergeant, Frontier Army Scouts. 1851 to 1862. Specialty: long-range reconnaissance and elimination. Confirmed kills 47. Classified discharge. Record sealed. Boone read it 3 times. 47 confirmed kills. The number that made it into official records probably represented a fraction of the real total. And classified discharge usually meant something the Army didn't want public. "Mother of Christ," Boone whispered. What? Deputy Porter leaned over to read the telegraph. His face went pale. The quiet rancher? That quiet rancher? Not just a rancher, Boone said. He's one of the Army's ghost shooters, the ones they sent after targets nobody else could reach. He stood up, grabbed his hat. We need to get to Miller's Canyon. Now. Why? Let him kill Pike's whole gang. Because, Boone said grimly, men like Hale don't stop killing just because the target's dead. Once you wake that up inside someone, it's hard to put back to sleep. They rode hard for the canyon, but they were hours behind the bloodshed. In the canyon, Pike had lost 6 men. 6 of his 12-man gang dead in the span of a few hours, killed by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't locate, couldn't fight. The survivors were breaking. Even Pike could see it in their eyes. The wild desperation that came before men abandoned all loyalty and ran for their lives. We make a stand, Pike said, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. Right here. Together. He's just one man. One man who's killed half of us, someone shouted back. Then we find him. Pike was screaming now, all pretense of control gone. Split up. Search every ridge, every boulder, every... The next shot didn't come from the ridge. It came from inside the canyon itself. Because Caleb had moved. While they'd been focused on the high ground, he'd descended during the confusion, working his way into the canyon network. Now he was among them, close enough to hear their voices, close enough to smell their campfire. The hunter had entered the killing ground. A scream cut through the afternoon air, then another shot, then silence. Pike and his remaining men pressed their backs together, weapons drawn, surrounded by invisible death. The psychological warfare was complete. They weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting their own terror. Show yourself, Pike roared into the empty canyon. Face me like a man. No answer, just wind and echo. Then, from somewhere in the shadows, Caleb's voice, quiet, calm, utterly devoid of emotion. You burned my home. Pike spun toward the sound, fired blind into the rocks. The shots echoed uselessly. You threatened innocent people, Caleb continued, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. Drove families from their land, killed for profit. So what? Pike screamed. You were a soldier. You killed too. I killed to protect people. You kill because you enjoy it. Another shot, another body. There's a difference. Pike was breathing hard now, panic setting in for real. He'd faced dangerous men before. But this wasn't a gunfight. This was an execution. Methodical, unstoppable. Listen, Pike's voice cracked. Listen. We can make a deal. Whatever you want. Money, land. I'll leave the valley. We'll all leave. Silence. Then Caleb's voice, colder than winter stone. It's too late for that. The sun was setting when Sheriff Boone finally reached the canyon entrance. What he found stopped him cold. Bodies, scattered through the canyon like broken toys. Some killed at distance, others up close. All of them wearing the same expression of absolute terror. The massacre had been thorough, professional, and completely one-sided. Sweet Jesus, Porter whispered. Boone dismounted slowly, his hand on his pistol more from habit than expectation. Whatever had happened here was over. The canyon had the feel of a graveyard, heavy with death and silence. They found Pike Mercer near the center of the killing ground. He was alive. Barely. Shot through both legs, unable to run, propped against a rock and bleeding into the dust. His face was white with shock and blood loss. When he saw Boone, something like relief flickered across his features. Help! Pike gasped. Help me! Where's Hale? Boone demanded. Gone. He's gone. Boone knelt beside Pike, checking the wounds, deliberately placed to disable, not kill, to make him suffer, to make him wait. What happened here? Pike laughed, a broken, desperate sound. He happened. The ghost happened. We never had a chance. Never. His eyes focused on Boone. Who is he? Who is Caleb Hale? Boone didn't answer, just stared up at the canyon walls, at the perfect shooting positions, at the tactical nightmare that Pike had walked into. He's the man you should have left alone, Boone said finally. As they loaded Pike onto a horse for the ride back to town, the sun finished setting, painting the canyon walls blood red. Somewhere out there, Caleb Hale was walking through the darkness, returning to the burned ruins of his home, returning to a life that could never be peaceful again. Because some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. And some men, once reminded of what they were, can never fully forget. The walk back from Miller's Canyon took Caleb 3 hours through country he knew better than his own reflection. Every rock formation, every dry creek bed, every stand of cottonwood trees, he'd mapped this land in his mind during 12 years of pretending to be someone else. Now, with Pike's blood still drying on his boots, that pretense felt like a joke he'd been telling himself. The ranch came into view just after midnight, or what was left of it. The barn had collapsed entirely, just a skeleton of charred beams jutting toward the stars like broken ribs. The cabin was worse, nothing but a foundation and ash. Even the porch where he'd sat with Sarah on summer evenings was gone, consumed by flames meant to teach him a lesson about challenging Pike Mercer. Caleb stood in the darkness, the Sharp's rifle heavy in his hands, and felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, just a hollow emptiness that stretched back 12 years to another grave, another loss, another promise he'd failed to keep. He set the rifle against what remained of the fence and started sifting through the wreckage with his bare hands. Most of it was worthless: melted tools, broken furniture, ash, and char. But near where the bedroom had been, he found the metal lockbox he'd kept under the floorboards. The exterior was scorched black, but the contents were intact. Inside was the photograph of Sarah, her smile frozen in sepia tones, forever young, forever alive in that single moment before the fever took her. Caleb held it up to the moonlight, studying her face like he was seeing it for the first time. "I tried," he said to the empty air. "I really tried to be what you wanted." The photograph didn't answer. Dead people never did. He was still sitting there in the ruins when he heard the horses approaching. 2 riders, moving slow and cautious through the darkness. Caleb's hand went to the rifle automatically, old instincts taking over before conscious thought could intervene. "Hale?" Sheriff Boone's voice carried across the distance. "That you?" Caleb didn't answer immediately, just watched them approach, calculating angles and distances out of habit. He could kill them both before they cleared the fence line. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome, but undeniable. "It's me," he said finally, setting the rifle down deliberately where they could see it. Boone and Porter dismounted 50 feet away, their own weapons holstered but accessible. Smart. They'd learned something today about underestimating quiet men. "We found Pike," Boone said, walking forward slowly. "Found all of them. You left quite a mess in that canyon." "Pike alive?" "Barely. Lost a lot of blood. Doc Patterson's working on him now." Boone stopped 10 feet away, his eyes moving from the rifle to Caleb's face to the ruins behind him. "You want to tell me what happened here?" "You already know what happened. I mean before. Before the canyon. Before you put 6 men in the ground and crippled the most dangerous outlaw in 3 territories." Boone pulled a folded telegraph paper from his pocket. "Sergeant Caleb Hale, Frontier Army Scouts. 47 confirmed kills." The number hung in the air between them like smoke. Caleb looked at the paper, then at Boone. "That was a long time ago." "Not so long you forgot how to do it." "No," Caleb admitted. "I didn't forget." Porter shifted uncomfortably, his hand drifting toward his pistol. Boone noticed and shot him a warning glance. The last thing anyone needed was a jumpy deputy starting something with a man who'd just killed 6 people in a single afternoon. "So what now?" Boone asked. "You planning on coming into town with us? Answering some questions?" "Am I under arrest?" "Should you be?" Caleb met his eyes. "Pike and his gang burned my home, threatened my life, shot at me first. I defended myself." "You did more than defend yourself. You hunted them." "Yes," Caleb said simply. No excuses, no justification, just acknowledgement. Boone scratched his jaw, thinking. By the letter of the law, Caleb had every right to defend his property. But there was defending yourself, and then there was tracking men into a canyon and executing them with military precision. The line between the two was supposed to be clear, except nothing about this situation was clear. "The people in town," Boone said slowly, "they're scared. Not of Pike anymore. He's finished. They're scared of you. They're asking questions about who you really are." "I'm a rancher." "You were a rancher. Now you're something else." Boone gestured at the burned ruins. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Caleb stood up, brushing ash from his pants. In the moonlight, he looked older than his 50 years, worn down by violence and grief and too many choices that couldn't be taken back. "I'm going to rebuild," he said, "same as before." "Just like that? You think people are going to forget what you did?" "I don't care if they forget. Pike came for me. I ended it. Now it's over. Now it's—" But even as he said the words, Caleb knew they weren't true. Nothing was ever really over. Violence had a way of echoing forward, of creating ripples that spread outward until they drowned everything in their path. Boone must have seen something in his expression because his voice softened. "Look, I'm not here to arrest you. Far as I'm concerned, you did this valley a service, but I need to know you're not going to become the next problem." "I'm not." "You sure about that? Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who just remembered he's good at killing. That's a dangerous thing to remember." Caleb picked up the photograph of Sarah, slipping it carefully into his pocket. "I never forgot. I just stopped doing it. And now? Now I'm going to rebuild my ranch and live quietly, same as I've been doing for 12 years. Porter spoke up for the first time, his voice tight with poorly concealed fear. "What if more trouble comes? What if Pike's got friends who want revenge?" "Then they'll end up like Pike," Caleb said flatly. The deputy's hand definitely went to his pistol this time. Boone stepped between them quickly, his hands raised in a calming gesture that was directed more at Porter than Caleb. "Easy," Boone said. "Everyone just take a breath." He turned back to Caleb. "You can't go around threatening—" "I didn't threaten anyone. I answered his question." Caleb's voice remained level, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You want to know what I'll do if Pike's friends come looking? I'll do exactly what I did today. I'll end the threat." "That's not how the law works. The law didn't protect the Morgan family, didn't protect the Williams, didn't protect me." Caleb met Boone's eyes. "I'm not blaming you. I know you did what you could, but don't lecture me about how things are supposed to work when we both know they don't." The truth of that statement settled over them like a heavy blanket. Boone wanted to argue, wanted to defend the system he'd served for 20 years. But standing in the ruins of a burned ranch, with 6 bodies still cooling in Miller's Canyon, the argument felt hollow. "Just stay out of trouble," Boone said finally. "And for the love of everything, don't shoot anyone else unless they're actively trying to kill you." That was always the plan. Boone and Porter mounted their horses, preparing to leave. But the sheriff paused, looking back at Caleb one more time. "You know what bothers me most about this?" Boone said. "It's not the killing. Men like Pike, they had it coming. What bothers me is how easily you did it, like you never stopped being a soldier. Like the rancher was just a costume you wore." Caleb didn't respond. What could he say? That Boone was right? That every day for 12 years had been an act of will, of choosing to be someone different from what he was trained to be? That Sarah's love had been the only thing holding that costume together, and without her, it was all just thread and illusion? "Get some rest," Boone said. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting." They rode off into the darkness, leaving Caleb alone with his ruins and his rifle, and the ghost of a promise he'd made to a dead woman. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat on the foundation stones where his cabin had been, watching the stars wheel overhead and trying to figure out what came next. The easy answer was to leave. Pack up, ride out, start over somewhere else. Become someone new in a place where nobody knew about Miller's Canyon. But he'd tried running before. After Sarah died, he'd run from his grief, from his past, from everything that hurt. He'd buried his rifle and his memories and pretended he could be someone different. It hadn't worked. The past always caught up eventually. The only question was whether you faced it or let it destroy you from behind. By dawn, Caleb had made his decision. He would stay. He would rebuild. And if people feared him now, if they whispered his name and crossed to the other side of the street, when he came to town, then so be it. Fear was better than pity, anyway. The sun was clearing the eastern ridge when he heard the wagon approaching. Caleb grabbed the rifle instinctively, then forced himself to set it down when he recognized the driver, Samuel Morgan. The rancher Pike had shot in the leg just days ago. His wound was bandaged, and he moved stiffly as he climbed down from the wagon seat, but he was alive. Behind him in the wagon bed were supplies, lumber, nails, canvas, tools. "Figured you could use some help," Morgan said, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes. Caleb stared at him. "Why?" Because Pike's gang burned my barn too. And you're the one who stopped them. Morgan finally looked up. I know what people are saying about you, about what you did in the canyon. Hell, half of them are calling you a murderer. What do you call me? Morgan was quiet for a moment, considering. I call you the man who did what the rest of us were too scared to do. He gestured at the supplies. This ain't much, but it's a start. Before Caleb could respond, 2 more wagons appeared on the road, then 3 more, then a rider on horseback. By mid-morning, nearly 20 people had arrived at the ruins, ranchers, farmers, townspeople, even a couple of the merchants from Main Street. Nobody said much. They just started working. Men began clearing debris and sorting through salvageable materials. Women brought food and water. Children hauled ash and broken boards away from the building site. It wasn't organized or efficient. People got in each other's way. Tools went missing. Arguments broke out over the best way to frame a wall. But they came. And they stayed. Caleb stood to the side, watching them work on his land, rebuilding what Pike had destroyed. He didn't know how to feel about it. Part of him wanted to tell them to leave, that he could handle this alone. That's how he'd always handled things, alone, self-sufficient, needing nobody. But another part, the part that still heard Sarah's voice in quiet moments, knew that was exactly wrong. Isolation hadn't protected him. It had just made him vulnerable in different ways. You going to stand there all day, or you going to help? Martha Fielding called out. She was the woman who'd found the first body in Miller's Canyon, and she looked at Caleb now without fear, just expectation. Caleb picked up a hammer and joined them. The work continued through the morning and into the afternoon. The basic frame of a new cabin began to take shape. Smaller than the old one, but solid. Someone started a cooking fire and made stew for lunch. Kids played in the dirt. Men swapped stories while measuring boards. It felt almost normal, like a barn raising, like the community gatherings Caleb had avoided for 12 years, like something resembling life instead of just survival. Then the rider arrived. He came hard and fast, his horse lathered with sweat. Everyone stopped working as he galloped up to the construction site and nearly fell off his mount. Sheriff needs help, the rider gasped. Pike's escaped. The hammer slipped from Caleb's hand. What? Morgan demanded. How? Dutch Carver. He survived. He came back with 3 other men, broke into the doc's office, killed Deputy Porter. The rider's voice was shaking. They took Pike and rode north. Sheriff's trying to track them, but he's alone and... The rider stopped talking when he noticed everyone was looking at Caleb. The change in him was subtle but unmistakable. The relaxed posture gone, replaced by something coiled and ready. His eyes had gone flat and calculating. The quiet rancher had disappeared again, replaced by the thing he'd tried so hard to bury. How long ago? Caleb's voice had changed too, harder, colder. Maybe 2 hours. They're headed toward the northern pass. Caleb did the math instantly. 2 hours. 4 men, 1 wounded. They'd be moving slow, staying off the main trails. The northern pass led to wild country, mining camps, abandoned settlements, places where a man could disappear for years if he knew where to look. If Pike made it through that pass, he'd be gone. I'm going, Caleb said, already moving toward where his horse was tethered. Wait. Morgan limped forward. You can't go alone. Take some of us with you. No. Caleb, there's 4 of them. Even you can't. I said no. Caleb was checking his rifle, loading ammunition into his saddlebags with practiced efficiency. Every movement precise, automatic, the muscle memory of a soldier preparing for combat. You're farmers and merchants. You'll get killed. And you won't? Caleb swung into the saddle, the massive Sharps rifle secured in its scabbard. For a moment, he looked down at all the people who'd come to help him rebuild. Good people, decent people. The kind of people Sarah would have wanted him to protect. Pike killed Deputy Porter, Caleb said quietly. He's killed others. He'll kill more if he gets away. This ends now. The sheriff, someone started. The sheriff's a good man, but he's not equipped for this. Caleb gathered the reins. I am. He rode off before anyone could argue further, pushing his horse hard toward the northern pass. Behind him, the half-built cabin stood against the sky like a promise he might not live to keep. Martha Fielding watched him disappear, then turned to her husband. He's going to kill them all, isn't he? Her husband didn't answer. They both knew the truth. The ghost had been awakened, and now it was hunting. Caleb pushed his horse through country that got progressively rougher as he rode north. The fertile valley gave way to scrub brush and rock, then to steep ravines and dense pine forest. This was the kind of terrain that swallowed men whole, the kind where you could pass within 10 feet of someone and never know they were there. Perfect for an ambush. He found Sheriff Boone 3 hours later, crouched behind a fallen log with his rifle trained on a distant ridge. The lawman was bleeding from a shallow wound on his arm, his face tight with pain and frustration. "They hit you?" Caleb asked, sliding off his horse and taking cover beside him. Boone nearly shot him out of reflex before recognizing the voice. "Christ, Hale, make some noise next time." "You hit?" Caleb repeated. "Grazed. I got too close and Dutch saw me. They've got good position up on that ridge." Boone pointed. 4 men. One of them is Pike. They know I'm here. Been trading shots for the last hour." Caleb studied the terrain with professional assessment. The ridge was about 400 yards out, with good cover and clear sight lines. Pike's group held the high ground, which meant any frontal approach would be suicide. For most people. "You got medical supplies?" Caleb asked. "In my saddlebag. Why?" "Because you're going to need them after you patch that arm properly." Caleb started unpacking his rifle. "Then you're going to wait here." "The hell I am. Porter was my deputy, my friend. And he's dead because you tried to handle this like a lawman, all proper procedure and calling out for surrender." Caleb's hands moved with mechanical precision, assembling the sharps and checking the scope. "These men don't surrender. They don't negotiate. They kill until someone stops them." "So you're just going to murder them?" "No. I'm going to end the threat they represent." Caleb looked at Boone. "You want to arrest me after? That's fine. But right now, you need to decide if you want Pike in custody or if you want him dead, because those are the only 2 options, and I can only deliver one of them." Boone was quiet for a long time, struggling with principles and pragmatism. He was a good sheriff, believed in the law, in due process, in giving men a chance to answer for their crimes in court. But Porter's body was still warm back in town, and Pike Mercer had demonstrated repeatedly that he didn't operate within any framework of law or morality. "Make it quick," Boone said finally. "Whatever you're going to do." Caleb nodded and moved into position. He'd already spotted a route during his initial scan, a dry creek bed that would get him within 300 yards without being seen. From there, with the wind at his back and good elevation, the shots were makeable. Not easy, but makeable. He worked his way through the creek bed with agonizing slowness. Every step carefully placed, every movement deliberate. Speed got you killed. Impatience got you killed. The only thing that kept you alive was discipline. Sarah used to tease him about it. "You move like you're walking through a house of sleeping babies," she'd say, laughing at how carefully he approached even simple tasks. "That's how you stay alive," he'd reply. "But we're not at war anymore." "I know," except he hadn't known. Not really. Because the war never ends for some people. It just goes quiet for a while, waiting for the right moment to wake back up. Caleb reached his position and set up the rifle. 400 yards to target, wind coming from the west at maybe 10 miles per hour, temperature dropping as afternoon turned to evening. He adjusted for all of it, making calculations that were part mathematics and part instinct developed over decades. Through the scope, he could see them clearly now. 4 men huddled behind rocks on the ridge. Dutch Carver, his shoulder bandaged but still holding a rifle. 2 others he didn't recognize, probably men from Pike's extended network. And Pike himself, looking pale and weak from blood loss but very much alive. Caleb centered the crosshairs on Dutch first. The man who'd come back for Pike. The man who'd killed Deputy Porter. The man who'd earned this bullet 12 times over. He exhaled slowly, let his heartbeat settle, and fired. The shot echoed across the canyon. Dutch jerked backward, the rifle tumbling from his hands. He was dead before his body hit the ground. The other 3 scattered immediately, diving for better cover. But Caleb was already working the rifle's action, loading the next round, adjusting for the new target positions. The second shot caught one of the unknown men as he ran for a different rock. Center mass. Clean kill. Now Pike and his remaining companion knew exactly where Caleb was. They started returning fire, bullets kicking up dirt and rock around his position. One round came close enough that Caleb felt the air displacement against his cheek. He didn't flinch, just stayed calm, waited for them to empty their magazines. Let them waste ammunition on bad angles and panic shots. When the firing paused, they'd have to reload. Caleb moved, not back to safety, but forward. 30 yards closer, to a new position they wouldn't expect. By the time they'd reloaded and started searching for him at his old location, he was already setting up again. This time, Pike's last man made the fatal mistake of exposing himself while trying to spot Caleb's new position. The third shot took him in the upper chest. That left only Pike. Caleb could hear Pike's breathing from 50 yards away, ragged, panicked, the sound of a man who'd finally run out of options and knew it. "Hale!" Pike's voice cracked across the rocks. "Hale, I know you're out there." Caleb didn't respond, just kept moving, circling around Pike's position with the patience of a man who'd done this 100 times before. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks now, painting everything in shades of orange and red. Blood colors. Fitting. "Listen to me," Pike tried again. "Whatever they're paying you, I'll double it, triple it. I've got money stashed, more than you could spend in 10 years. Still nothing from Caleb. He was close enough now to see Pike clearly without the scope. The outlaw was pressed against a boulder, his stolen pistol shaking in his hands. Both legs were bandaged from Caleb's previous shots, and fresh blood had soaked through the wrappings. He looked like what he was, a dying animal backed into a corner. "I'm sorry about your ranch," Pike's voice was getting higher, more desperate. "I'm sorry, all right? It was just business. Just business. We can work this out." Caleb chambered around. The metallic click echoed across the rocks, and Pike's head snapped toward the sound. "Please," Pike whispered, and now the tears were real. "Please don't. I'm begging you." Caleb stepped out from behind his cover, the rifle trained on Pike's chest. In the fading light, he looked less like a man and more like a force of nature. Inevitable, unstoppable, without mercy or hesitation. Pike raised his pistol with shaking hands. "Don't," Caleb said quietly. "I have to. You're going to kill me anyway." "Put it down and you live. I'll let the sheriff take you in." Pike laughed, a broken sound full of despair. "You think I'm stupid? You've been hunting me for days. You killed my whole gang. You're not letting me walk out of here." "I'm giving you a choice." "Bullshit. You already made this choice." Pike's finger tightened on the trigger. "You made it the second you dug up that rifle." He wasn't wrong. Caleb had known how this would end before it started. Maybe Pike had too. Maybe they'd both been playing out a script written the moment Pike decided to burn that ranch. Pike fired first. The shot went wide. Hands too unsteady, pain too intense, fear overwhelming everything else. The bullet ricocheted off stone 5 feet from Caleb's position. Caleb's return shot was perfect. Pike jerked backward, the pistol falling from his hands. He slumped against the boulder, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been relief. The burden of running, of fighting, of being Pike Mercer, all of it gone in an instant. Caleb lowered the rifle and walked forward slowly. Pike was still alive, but barely. The light was fading from his eyes in the same way it was fading from the sky. "You were right," Pike whispered, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth, about it being too late. Caleb knelt beside him. Up close he could see how young Pike actually was. Maybe 35. A whole life ahead of him that would now end on this ridge, surrounded by the bodies of men he'd led to their deaths. "You could have left," Caleb said. "After the first time. After the canyon. You could have just ridden away." "And go where?" Pike coughed. More blood. "Men like me, we don't get to retire. We ride until someone faster comes along." His eyes found Caleb's face. "Guess you were faster." "It wasn't about speed." "No," Pike agreed. "It was about you being what you are. What you've always been." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a wheeze. "The quiet rancher. That's good. That's real good. Had us all fooled." "I wasn't trying to fool anyone. I was trying to be different." "How'd that work out?" Caleb didn't answer. They both knew. Pike's breathing was getting shallower. Minutes left, maybe less. But something in his fading eyes suggested he had one more thing to say. "You know what's funny?" Pike whispered. "I knew your wife." Caleb went very still. "Years ago. Before I was Pike Mercer. Before I was anything. Winter of '63, I was just a kid running from a bad situation. Half frozen, starving, wandered into this little ranch out near the Eastern Territories. Pike's voice was getting weaker. Woman there took me in. Fed me. Let me sleep in the barn. Didn't ask questions. Just helped because that's who she was." The world seemed to stop moving. She had dark hair, Pike continued, kind eyes. Talked about her husband being away on military business. Said he'd be home soon, said I could stay until the storm passed. He coughed again. I stayed 3 days. She made soup, good soup, never forgot it. Caleb's hands were shaking. Sarah. Never knew her name, but yeah, had to be. Pike's eyes were almost closed now. She saved my life, and 10 years later I burned down her house without knowing it. Without knowing I was destroying the home of the only person who ever showed me kindness without wanting something back. The irony was so brutal, it didn't even feel real. Caleb had killed Pike for burning his ranch, for threatening innocent people, for being a monster who needed to be stopped. But if he'd known this, if he'd known Pike was the frightened kid Sarah had sheltered during that terrible winter, would it have changed anything? Could it have changed anything? I'm sorry, Pike breathed. For what it's worth. I'm sorry I became this. Then his eyes went vacant and his chest stopped moving, and Pike Mercer was gone. Caleb sat there in the dying light, surrounded by bodies and spent shell casings and the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Sheriff Boone finally catching up. Is he dead? Boone asked. Caleb nodded. The others? All dead. Boone surveyed the scene. 4 bodies, 1 exhausted killer, and a whole lot of blood soaking into the rocks. This would be in the reports, in the newspapers, in the stories people told for decades. The day Caleb Hale killed Pike Mercer's entire gang single-handedly. You all right? Boone asked. No, Caleb said honestly. But I will be. They buried the bodies there on the ridge. It seemed pointless to haul them all the way back to town, and nobody was going to mourn Pike Mercer anyway. Boone said a few words over the graves, force of habit more than respect, and then they rode back toward the valley in silence. It was full dark by the time they reached town. News of Pike's death had already spread somehow, that mysterious communication network that existed in small communities. People were out in the streets, celebrating, passing bottles and singing songs like a war had ended. In a way it had, but Caleb felt no satisfaction, no relief, just a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical. He'd become the thing he swore he'd never be again, had killed men with the same cold efficiency he'd promised Sarah he'd left behind. And for what? Pike was dead, but so was Deputy Porter, so were a dozen other men. And somewhere in that chain of violence was a scared kid who'd eaten Sarah's soup and then grown up to burn her house down. The circle was complete and meaningless and exactly what violence always created. Boone stopped his horse in front of the sheriff's office. You need anything? Just to go home. You still planning to rebuild? Caleb thought about the half-finished cabin, about the people who'd shown up to help, about Martha Fielding calling him back to work like he was one of them instead of the ghost who'd killed 6 men in a canyon. Yeah, he said. I'm going to rebuild. Boone nodded. Good. This valley needs people who stay, not more people who run. He paused. You did right, Hale. However it feels, you did right. Caleb wasn't sure he believed that, but he appreciated the attempt at comfort. He rode out of town slowly, aware of the eyes watching him from windows and doorways. Tomorrow they'd go back to whispering about him, back to keeping their distance, back to treating him like a dangerous element that might explode if provoked. But tonight, they were grateful. He'd take what he could get. The burned ranch looked different in the moonlight. The half-built frame cast strange shadows across the foundation, and the smell of charred wood still hung in the air. But underneath that, Caleb could smell fresh-cut lumber and sawdust, signs of construction, signs of life trying to reassert itself. He unsaddled his horse and fed it, then sat on the foundation stones where his cabin used to be. The rifle lay across his knees. He should clean it, store it away, go back to pretending it didn't exist. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Because Pike had been right about one thing: you couldn't unmake what you were. You could hide it, suppress it, pretend it didn't exist. But the core remained, always, waiting for the right circumstances to resurface. Caleb was a killer. Trained by the army, refined by years of frontier warfare, and hardened by loss. That's what he was. Not a rancher who'd been a soldier once, a soldier who'd been pretending to be a rancher. The question now was what he did with that truth. He pulled out the photograph of Sarah, studying it in the moonlight. She'd known. Not the details, maybe, not the body count or the specific horrors, But she'd known what he was capable of and loved him anyway, had seen the violence underneath and believed he could be more than that. "I tried," he said to her image. "I really did try to be better." The photograph didn't judge him, didn't forgive him either, just existed as evidence of a time when he'd been more than this. Footsteps approached from the darkness. Caleb's hand went to the rifle automatically, then relaxed when he recognized Samuel Morgan's limp. "Figured you'd be back," Morgan said, sitting down on the foundation without asking permission. "Town's celebrating. They want to throw you a parade." "I don't want a parade." "Yeah, I told them that." Morgan pulled out a flask and took a long drink, then offered it to Caleb. "Told them you just want to be left alone." "They didn't listen. They're planning something for tomorrow." Caleb took the flask and drank. Whiskey. Good whiskey, probably saved for special occasions. "I'm not a hero." "Didn't say you were, but you stopped Pike when the rest of us couldn't. That counts for something." "Does it? Porter's still dead. Pike's gang killed him while I was off playing executioner in the canyon." "Pike's gang killed him," Morgan repeated. "Not you. You didn't pull that trigger." "I might as well have. If I'd brought Pike in alive the first time, then Dutch would have broken him out the first time. Then more people would have died. Then you'd be having this same conversation with a different list of bodies." Morgan took the flask back. "Stop trying to make this your fault. Evil men do evil things. You stopped them. That's the story." But it wasn't that simple. It never was. Caleb had stopped Pike, true, but he'd also remembered what it felt like to kill. Had felt the old satisfaction of a perfectly placed shot, the grim pleasure of hunting men who deserved hunting. And that feeling scared him more than any outlaw ever could, because it meant Pike had been right. The quiet rancher had always been a costume. The killer underneath was the real thing. "You hear what happened to Pike's nephew?" Morgan asked, changing the subject. "Jake Mercer? Kid was with the gang when you hit them in the canyon. He ran, took off during the first shots and never came back. Smart kid. Sheriff tracked him down yesterday, found him hiding in a barn 20 miles south, scared out of his mind. He's 17. 17 years old, and Pike had him robbing and threatening people like it was normal." Caleb remembered seeing a young face among Pike's gang that first day. Had dismissed it as irrelevant at the time. Just another outlaw in a group of outlaws. What's going to happen to him? Boone's trying to figure that out. Kid's got no family now, no home, no skills except the bad ones Pike taught him. Morgan shrugged. Probably end up in a work camp or worse. Or worse, Caleb repeated. Another life ruined by Pike's legacy. Another casualty in a war that kept echoing forward no matter how many people died. They sat in silence for a while, passing the flask back and forth. Around them, the night sounds of the valley filled the air. Crickets, distant coyotes, wind moving through grass. Peaceful sounds, the kind that made you forget about blood and violence and choices that couldn't be unmade. "I'm heading back to town," Morgan said finally. "You need anything?" "No, thanks for checking." Morgan stood, wincing at the pain in his leg. Pike's bullet had done permanent damage. He'd walk with that limp for the rest of his life. A permanent reminder of the day he'd tried to reason with a monster. "For what it's worth," Morgan said, "I'm glad you're here. Glad you stayed. This valley needs men who know how to stand up when it matters." He left before Caleb could respond, limping back into the darkness. Caleb sat alone again, the rifle across his knees, the photograph in his pocket, and nothing but questions echoing in his head. What was he now? Still a rancher? Still pretending? Or had he finally accepted what Sarah had spent years trying to help him move past? The answer didn't come. Maybe it never would. He spent the next 3 days throwing himself into construction work. The cabin took shape slowly. 4 walls, a roof frame, windows. It wasn't fancy, wasn't even particularly well built. But it was shelter, and shelter was enough. People kept coming by with supplies, with food, with offers to help. Caleb accepted it all with awkward gratitude, unused to being part of a community again. He'd spent 12 years as the hermit on the edge of town, and now suddenly everyone wanted to know him. It was uncomfortable. But it was also something else. Something like hope. On the 3rd day, Sheriff Boone rode out with another man behind him. Young, thin, terrified eyes that tracked everything like he expected violence from any direction. Jake Mercer, Pike's nephew. Caleb set down his hammer and waited for them to approach. The kid stayed behind Boone like the sheriff was a shield between him and the world. "Got a proposition for you," Boone said, dismounting. "Probably going to say no, but I'm asking anyway." "What kind of proposition?" "The kid here? He's got nowhere to go, no family, no prospects, no future except a bad one." Boone gestured at Jake. "He's 17, old enough to hang for what Pike had him doing. Young enough that maybe he could still turn out different." Caleb looked at Jake. Really looked at him. The kid was shaking, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He'd seen his uncle die, seen his entire world collapse in the span of a few days, and now he was standing in front of the man who'd caused it all. "You want me to what?" Caleb asked. "Take him in?" "Teach him something useful. Keep him out of trouble. Give him a chance to be something other than Pike Mercer's nephew." The request was so absurd Caleb almost laughed. Take in the nephew of the man he'd killed? Teach him? Trust him not to slit Caleb's throat in the middle of the night? "No," Caleb said flatly. "I told you he'd say no," Jake muttered, his voice bitter with resignation. "Shut up," Boone said, then turned back to Caleb. "Look, I know what I'm asking, but what's the alternative? I send him to a work camp. He'll come out harder and meaner. I let him go free. He'll probably end up like Pike, and I hang him." Boone trailed off. "He's just a kid. He rode with Pike. He made choices. Yeah, at 14 when his parents died and Pike was the only family he had left. What choices did he really have?" Caleb studied Jake again. The kid wouldn't meet his eyes, just stared at the ground, shoulders hunched, waiting for judgment. "You know who I am?" Caleb asked him directly. Jake nodded. "You're the man who killed my uncle, killed Dutch, killed everyone. And you hate me for that." The kid hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm scared of you. That's different than hate." Honest answer. Maybe too honest. But at least it wasn't a lie. "I don't want to do this," Caleb said to Boone. "I'm not a teacher. I'm not good with kids. And I'm definitely not the right person to rehabilitate Pike Mercer's nephew. I'm not asking you to rehabilitate him. I'm asking you to give him work. Keep him busy. Keep him out of trouble." Boone's voice softened. "And maybe show him that there's another way to be strong besides violence." That last part hit harder than Caleb wanted to admit, because that's exactly what Sarah had tried to do for him, wasn't it? Show him another way to be strong, another way to exist beyond killing. He looked at the half-built cabin, at the work that still needed doing, at the future he was trying to cobble together from the wreckage of his past. 1 month, Caleb said finally. Trial period. He works, he learns, he stays out of trouble. Any problems? And he's gone. "Deal," Boone said quickly, before Caleb could change his mind. Jake looked up, surprise and fear mixing on his young face. "You're serious? You're actually going to let me stay?" "I'm going to let you work," Caleb corrected. "Whether you stay depends entirely on you." Boone left, leaving Jake standing awkwardly in the middle of the construction site. The kid looked lost, like he'd been expecting prison or hanging and couldn't quite process this alternative. "You know how to hammer a nail?" Caleb asked. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir, call me Caleb." He picked up a hammer and tossed it to Jake, who caught it clumsily. "Those beams need to be secured to the frame. Think you can handle that?" Jake nodded and moved toward the work area, grateful to have something to do with his hands. Caleb watched him for a moment, wondering what the hell he'd just agreed to. Taking in Pike Mercer's nephew, teaching him carpentry and ranching, trusting him not to murder Caleb in his sleep. Sarah would have loved this. She'd always believed people could change, could be more than their worst moments. Caleb wasn't sure he shared that belief, but he was willing to try. For her. And maybe a little bit for himself. The work continued through the afternoon. Jake didn't talk much, just followed instructions and did what he was told. But Caleb noticed how the kid's hand shook whenever a loud noise broke the silence, how his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, how he flinched when Caleb moved too quickly. Combat stress. Fear. The kind that came from seeing too much violence too young. Caleb recognized it because he'd felt it himself decades ago, before he'd learned to bury it under layers of professional detachment. By sunset, the roof frame was complete. Caleb stepped back to survey the work, satisfied with the progress. The cabin wouldn't be finished for weeks, maybe months, but the bones were good, solid. "You did good work today," Caleb said. Jake looked surprised by the compliment. Thank you. There's beans cooking on the fire. Help yourself. Tomorrow we start early. The kid hesitated. Where do I sleep? Good question. The cabin was just a frame, the barn was ashes, and Caleb had been sleeping under canvas since the fire. For now, wherever you can find flat ground. Tomorrow we'll work on building you a proper bunkhouse. You're going to build me a bunkhouse? If you're working here, you need somewhere to sleep. That's just practical. Jake nodded slowly, still processing this new reality where someone was taking care of him instead of using him. He moved toward the fire and served himself beans, eating mechanically, like he couldn't quite taste the food. Caleb understood that too. The numbness that came after trauma. The way your body kept functioning even when your mind had checked out. They ate in silence. Two people who'd been on opposite sides of a war 48 hours ago, now sharing a fire and trying to figure out what came next. Can I ask you something? Jake said finally. Depends on the question. Did you have to kill them all? Uncle Pike, Dutch, everyone? Caleb considered lying, considered softening the truth. But the kid deserved honesty. Yes, he said. They chose violence. They wouldn't stop, so I stopped them. But there were 12 of them, and you were just one man. Numbers don't matter when you have surprise, position, and skill. Caleb stirred the fire with a stick. Your uncle made mistakes. He assumed I was weak because I was alone. He assumed I'd run because everyone else did. He was wrong on both counts. He used to say you were the most dangerous kind of enemy, the kind that looks harmless. Your uncle was smarter than he acted, just not smart enough to leave when he had the chance. Jake stared into the fire. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. He was my family, the only family I had. But he was also... He trailed off, unable to finish. A monster, Caleb supplied. You can say it. It's true. Yeah, a monster. Jake's voice was barely a whisper. Does that make me one too? For riding with him? That's up to you. You can spend your life being Pike Mercer's nephew, or you can be someone else. Your choice. What if I don't know how to be someone else? Caleb looked at the half-built cabin, at the work that still needed doing, at the future that was still uncertain. Then I guess we'll figure it out together. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised them both. Caleb would wake before dawn, start the fire, and have coffee brewing by the time Jake stumbled out of his bedroll. They'd work through the morning on the cabin, breaking only when the sun got too high and the heat became unbearable. Afternoons were for other tasks, mending fence, tending the horses, clearing brush from the property line. Jake proved to be a quick learner once he stopped expecting punishment for every mistake. The first week, he'd flinched every time Caleb raised his voice or moved too quickly. But gradually, as days passed without violence, the kid's shoulders began to unbend. His hands stopped shaking. He started asking questions instead of waiting to be told what to do. Why do you measure twice? Jake asked one morning, watching Caleb mark a board for cutting. Because wood's expensive and mistakes are permanent. Uncle Pike used to say measuring was for people who were afraid to commit. Caleb looked up from his work. Your uncle burned down 3 barns because he didn't plan properly. I'd say that proves my point. Jake considered this, then nodded. It was happening more often now, these little moments where the kid questioned the lessons Pike had taught him, where he started to see that maybe violence and recklessness weren't the only way to move through the world. But the progress wasn't linear. Some days Jake would wake up angry, grieving, resentful of the man who'd killed his only family. On those days, Caleb gave him space and hard physical labor, digging post holes, hauling rocks, anything that burned off the rage without requiring conversation. Other days, Jake would be almost chatty, asking about the valley, about ranching, about everything except the one topic neither of them wanted to discuss: what had happened in Miller's Canyon. It was Martha Fielding who finally broke the unspoken agreement of silence. She arrived one afternoon with a basket of food and the kind of determined expression that meant she had something to say and wasn't leaving until she'd said it. Jake was working on the far side of the property, giving Caleb a chance to intercept her before things got awkward. Mrs. Fielding, Caleb said, taking off his hat, appreciate the food, but you don't need to keep... I'm not here about food. She set the basket down with enough force to make her point. I'm here about that boy. Jake's doing fine. I'm sure he is, But people are talking, Caleb, asking questions about why you're harboring Pike Mercer's nephew. Some of them aren't happy about it. Caleb had expected this. Small towns ran on gossip and grudges, and Jake's presence was both. He's 17, working for his keep, not bothering anyone. He rode with Pike. He was there when they threatened the Morgan family. He was 14 when Pike took him in. 15 when the threats started. What was he supposed to do? Martha's expression softened slightly. I know it's not his fault, not really. But people remember, Sarah Chen still has nightmares about the day Pike's gang came to their farm. Samuel Morgan walks with a limp. These aren't just stories, Caleb. These are wounds that haven't healed. And taking it out on a scared kid is going to heal them? No, but people need someone to blame, and Pike's dead. She paused. They're afraid, Caleb. Afraid that boy's going to turn out just like his uncle. Afraid you're making a mistake. Then they're afraid of the wrong thing. Caleb looked toward where Jake was working, sweat soaking through his shirt as he dug fence post holes in the hard ground. That kid's not Pike. He's just trying to survive. I hope you're right. Martha picked up her basket, preparing to leave. But if you're wrong, a lot of people are going to get hurt. And this time, you won't be able to shoot your way out of it. She was gone before Caleb could respond, leaving him standing in the dust with her warning echoing in his head. The truth was, he didn't know if he was right about Jake. Didn't know if the kid could outrun his uncle's legacy, or if violence was so deeply embedded that it would surface eventually. All Caleb knew was that Sarah would have given Jake a chance, would have seen the frightened boy underneath the outlaw nephew. And if Caleb was going to honor her memory, he had to do the same. That evening, as they sat around the fire eating Martha's stew, Caleb decided it was time to address the elephant neither of them had been acknowledging. People in town are uncomfortable with you being here, he said bluntly. Jake's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. I figured. Some of them want me to send you away. Say you're a risk. Are you going to? No. But you need to understand what you're up against. Pike hurt a lot of people, killed some, threatened others. You weren't responsible for all of it, but you were there. People remember that. Jake set down his bowl, his appetite gone. What do you want me to do? Apologize? I was a kid. I did what Pike told me because I was scared of him. I know, but they don't know that. All they see is Pike's nephew living on Caleb Hale's ranch, and they wonder what that means. So what? I'm supposed to prove myself? Earn their forgiveness? Jake's voice was getting louder, angrier. How do I do that? How do I prove I'm not him? By not being him. By working hard, keeping your head down, and showing them through actions instead of words. That could take years. Probably will, Caleb agreed. Welcome to consequences. They don't disappear just because you want them to. Jake stood up abruptly, pacing near the fire, his hands clenched and unclenched, a nervous habit Caleb had noticed when the kid was trying to control his temper. You know what the worst part is? Jake said finally. Part of me misses him. Pike was a monster, I know that. But he was also the person who took me in when my parents died, who taught me to ride, to shoot, to survive. He's the reason I'm alive. He looked at Caleb. How messed up is that? Missing the man who ruined my life? It's not messed up. It's human. Caleb poked at the fire with a stick. People aren't all good or all bad. Pike did terrible things, but he also kept you alive. Both things can be true. Did you miss the people you killed? In the war? The question caught Caleb off guard. Nobody had ever asked him that before. Sarah had known better than to poke at those wounds, and everyone else assumed soldiers didn't feel anything about the men they killed. Some of them, Caleb admitted, not because I regretted killing them. Most of them needed killing, but because they were somebody's son, somebody's brother. And I took that away. Does it get easier? The guilt? No. You just get better at carrying it. Jake sat back down, staring into the flames. Pike used to say guilt was weakness, that strong men didn't apologize for doing what needed to be done. Pike was wrong about a lot of things. Yeah, Jake said quietly. Yeah, he was. They sat in silence for a while, two people carrying different versions of the same weight. The fire crackled. Night insects sang. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon. Thank you, Jake said eventually, for not giving up on me. Caleb nodded but didn't respond. Because the truth was, he wasn't doing this for Jake. He was doing it for Sarah. for the memory of a woman who'd believed people could be better than their worst moments. And maybe, in some small way, he was doing it for himself, trying to prove that violence didn't have to be the only language he spoke. The cabin was nearly finished by the end of the second month. 4 walls, a solid roof, windows that actually closed, and a door that locked from the inside. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. More of a home than Caleb had allowed himself to build in 12 years. Jake had his own small bunkhouse now, too. Nothing more than a single room with a bed and a stove, but it gave him privacy and dignity. The kid had earned it through hard work and steady improvement. He could measure and cut boards accurately now, could shoe a horse without supervision, could read the weather well enough to know when to bring livestock in from pasture. But more than the practical skills, something else had changed in Jake. The constant wariness had faded. The quick temper had cooled. He smiled more, talked more, existed in the world like a person instead of a cornered animal. Caleb tried not to get attached, tried to remember that this was temporary, that Jake would leave eventually to build his own life somewhere far from Pike's shadow. But despite his best efforts, he found himself caring about the kid's future in a way that felt dangerously close to fatherhood. It was Sheriff Boone who brought the news that would test everything they'd built. He rode out on a cold morning in late October, his face grim in a way that immediately set Caleb on edge. Jake was in the barn tending the horses, giving the 2 men privacy to talk. "We've got a problem," Boone said without preamble. 3 men rode into town yesterday asking questions about Pike Mercer, specifically asking about what happened to him. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. "Who are they?" "Call themselves the Dalton brothers. Clay, Frank, and Russell. They claim Pike owed them money from a job last year. They want to collect from his estate." Pike didn't have an estate. He had stolen goods and blood money. "They don't care. They're saying Jake is Pike's heir, which means the debt transfers to him." Boone's expression darkened. "They're giving the kid 1 week to come up with $5,000. Otherwise, they're going to take payment another way." $5,000. It might as well have been $5 million for a 17-year-old kid with nothing but the clothes on his back. "This is about Jake," Caleb said. "Not about money." "I know. They want leverage. Want to force the kid back into the life, or worse." Boone shook his head. "I can't stop them legally. They haven't done anything yet. Haven't made direct threats. They're just asking questions and making claims about debt." "Where are they now?" "The saloon. Making themselves comfortable. Making sure everyone in town knows they're here and what they want." Caleb looked toward the barn where Jake was working, oblivious to the storm that was coming for him. The kid had been doing so well, had been building something that resembled a future, and now 3 men from Pike's past were going to tear it all down. "I'll handle it," Caleb said. "Handle it how? You can't kill everyone who threatens that boy." "Why not? It worked before." "Because that's exactly what people are afraid of." Boone's voice rose. "You're proving them right, Caleb. Proving that violence is your only solution, that the ghost is still in control." "Then what do you suggest? I let them take Jake? Let them force him back into Pike's world?" "No. I suggest you try something different. Try letting the law handle it. Try trusting that there's another way." Caleb wanted to believe him, wanted to think that this could be resolved without bloodshed. But he'd seen too much, lived through too many situations where the law arrived too late or not at all. "The law didn't stop Pike," Caleb said quietly. "I did. And look what it cost you. Look what you became." Boone's voice softened. "You're not a soldier anymore, Caleb. You're a rancher with a kid who needs you to be better than what Pike was, better than what you were." The words hit harder than Caleb wanted to admit, because Boone was right. Killing the Dalton brothers would solve one problem and create a dozen others. Would teach Jake that violence was the answer, would prove to the valley that Caleb Hale was still the ghost, still the killer, still the man who solved problems with a rifle. "Give me 1 week," Caleb said. 1 week to find another solution. If I can't, then we do this your way." "My way being what?" "I don't know yet. But anything's better than teaching that kid that the only way to survive is to kill everyone who threatens you." Boone looked skeptical but nodded. 1 week. But if the Daltons make a move before then, all bets are off. After Boone left, Caleb found Jake in the barn, brushing down one of the horses with careful attention to detail. The kid looked up and smiled, a real smile, the kind that came from genuine contentment. "Sheriff have good news?" Jake asked. Caleb hesitated. His first instinct was to lie, to protect Jake from worry, but the kid deserved the truth. "3 men are in town asking about you. They claim Pike owed them money. They want you to pay his debts." The smile vanished. Jake's hand stilled on the brush, his whole body going tense. "The Daltons. You know them?" "Yeah, they worked with Pike sometimes. Did jobs he wouldn't touch because they were too messy." Jake's voice was tight. "They're not here about money. They're here because Pike's operation fell apart, and they need someone to blame. Boone says they're giving you a week to come up with $5,000. Jake laughed bitterly. "I don't have $500. I don't have anything." He set down the brush. "They know that. They're just creating an excuse to do what they came here to do." "Which is?" "Kill me, or force me to work for them. Either way, I'm useful or I'm dead." Jake leaned against the horse, suddenly looking exhausted. "I knew this was too good to be true. Knew I couldn't just walk away from Pike's world. It doesn't let you go that easy." Caleb watched the kid spiral, watched hope drain out of him like water from a cracked bucket. This was the moment where Jake could go one of two ways, either collapse back into being Pike's nephew or find the strength to be something more. "We'll figure it out," Caleb said. "How? You gonna kill them too? Add 3 more bodies to the pile?" "If I have to. And then what? More of Pike's associates come looking? More debts to settle? More reasons for everyone to be afraid of me?" Jake's voice cracked. "Maybe everyone was right. Maybe I should have just hanged. Would have been cleaner." "Stop it." Caleb's voice was sharp enough to cut through Jake's self-pity. "You don't get to quit now. Not after everything we've built here." "We haven't built anything. We've just been pretending. Pretending I'm not Pike's nephew, pretending the valley will accept me, pretending I have a future." Jake was shouting now, months of suppressed fear and anger finally erupting. "But I don't. I'm stuck being Pike Mercer's legacy, and nothing I do will ever change that." Caleb grabbed Jake by the shoulders, forcing the kid to look at him. "You listen to me. Pike doesn't get to define who you are. The Daltons don't get to define who you are. The only person who gets to decide that is you." "Easy for you to say. You're Caleb Hale. You're the ghost. You're a legend. I'm just some kid who got unlucky with family." "I'm a man who killed 47 people and spent 12 years trying to forget about it." Caleb released Jake's shoulders. "I'm a man who failed to protect his wife, who burned down his life, who became exactly what he was running from. You think I'm a legend? I'm a cautionary tale." Jake stared at him, breathing hard. "Then why? Why help me if you're so messed up yourself?" "Because someone helped me once, gave me a reason to be better, and I owe it to her memory to pass that forward." "Sarah?" Caleb nodded. "She believed people could change, could be more than their worst moments. I'm not sure I believe that, but I'm willing to try. For her. And for you." The fight went out of Jake. He slumped against the barn wall, looking young and scared and absolutely exhausted. "What do we do?" he asked quietly. "We go to town. We face them. And we find a solution that doesn't involve me killing 3 more men." "You think that's possible?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "But we're going to try." They rode into town the next morning, both of them tense and ready for trouble. The streets were quieter than usual. People had heard about the Daltons and were staying inside, avoiding whatever storm was about to break. The 3 men were sitting outside the saloon exactly where they wanted to be seen. Clay Dalton was the oldest, maybe 40, with a scarred face and dead eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. Frank was younger, quicker, with the nervous energy of a man who liked violence. Russell was the muscle, huge and silent, the kind who didn't need to talk because his presence said everything. They watched Caleb and Jake approach with predatory interest. "Well, well," Clay said, standing slowly. "Jake Mercer. Heard you were hiding out at the Ghost's ranch. That true?" "I'm not hiding," Jake said, his voice steadier than Caleb expected. "I'm working, living honest." "Living honest?" Clay laughed. "That's sweet, real sweet. Pike would have loved that." "Pike's dead." "Yeah, we heard. Shame about that. He owed us money from the Cooperstown job. 5,000 to be exact." "I don't have Pike's money. I don't have any money." "Not my problem. You're his nephew, his heir. His debt is your debt." Clay's smile didn't reach his eyes. Unless you want to work it off. We could use a kid who knows the territory. There it was. The real offer. Come work for us. Become what Pike tried to make you, or die trying to escape. He's not interested, Caleb said, speaking for the first time. Clay's attention shifted to him, and something changed in his expression. Recognition mixed with caution. Caleb Hale, the man himself. Pike spoke about you. Said you were the one that got away. The killer who learned to play rancher. Clay's hand drifted toward his pistol. Said if he ever ran into you again, he'd finish what should have been finished years ago. Pike had a lot of opinions. Most of them got him killed. That a threat? It's a fact. He came for me. I ended it. Same thing happens to anyone else who makes that mistake. Frank stood up, his hand already on his gun. You threatening us now? I'm explaining reality. Jake's under my protection. Anyone who touches him answers to me. Same goes for threats, intimidation, or creative interpretations of debt. Russell moved then, his bulk shifting in a way that suggested he was used to using it. The street was empty except for the 5 of them, and whatever witnesses were watching from behind curtains and closed doors. This was the moment where it would either escalate to violence or de-escalate to something else. Caleb could feel Jake tensing beside him, ready to run or fight depending on what happened next. You know what I think? Clay said, his tone conversational. I think you're bluffing. I think you're an old man trying to relive his glory days. I think you care about that boy, which makes you weak. And I think if we push, you'll break. Caleb smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. Only one way to find out. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Frank's hand tightened toward his gun. Russell took a step forward. Jake's breathing went shallow. Then Sheriff Boone's voice cut through the moment like a knife. Everyone just calm down. He was standing in the saloon doorway, shotgun in hand, pointed at nobody and everybody simultaneously. Behind him, Caleb could see Samuel Morgan and 3 other ranchers, all armed. This is town business now, Boone continued, not personal business. Clay, you got a legal debt claim. You file it properly. Otherwise, you're just harassing a citizen. Citizen? Clay laughed. That kid's Pike Mercer's. That kid is a 17-year-old boy working an honest job. He's not responsible for Pike's debts. The law is clear on that. Boone's voice hardened. And if you boys keep pushing, I'm going to start asking questions about what you were doing with Pike. Start digging into old warrants, old crimes. You want that attention? The threat landed. Clay's smile faded. Frank's hand moved away from his pistol. Russell stepped back. This isn't over, Clay said quietly. Yeah, it is, Boone replied. You boys have until sunset to leave town. After that, I'm arresting you for disturbing the peace. On what grounds? On the grounds that this is my town, and I said so. The Daltons exchanged looks. For a moment, it seemed like they might push, might call Boone's bluff and force the situation into violence. Then Clay shrugged. Ain't worth it. Too much heat, not enough reward. He looked at Jake. But you remember this, kid. You're only alive because the ghost protects you. When he's gone, when he's old or dead or just tired, Pike's world is going to come collecting, and there won't be anyone standing between you and it. They walked away, mounting their horses and riding out slowly, making sure everyone saw they were leaving by choice, not because they were scared. But Caleb had seen the look in Clay's eyes. They were scared, just smart enough not to show it. After they'd gone, Boone lowered his shotgun and looked at Caleb. That was close. Too close, Caleb agreed. Jake was shaking, adrenaline and relief mixing into something that looked like he might either laugh or cry. Thank you, all of you. I don't know how to... You don't have to thank us, Morgan said, stepping forward. You're part of this valley now. We protect our own. It was a simple statement, but the meaning was enormous. Jake wasn't just Caleb's project anymore. He was part of the community, part of something bigger than himself or Pike's shadow. The kid looked overwhelmed, like he didn't quite believe it was real. Caleb put a hand on his shoulder. Come on, let's go home. They rode back to the ranch in silence, both of them processing what had just happened. The Daltons were gone, but the message Clay had delivered hung in the air like smoke. This wasn't over. It never really was. Violence had echoes that stretched forward through time, creating ripples that touched people who weren't even born when the original crime was committed. Pike's legacy would follow Jake for years, maybe forever. And Caleb's reputation as the ghost would follow him just as long. But for now, They had breathing room, had time to build something stronger than fear. As they unsaddled the horses, Jake spoke quietly. That thing Clay said, about you not always being around to protect me. He's right. I know. So what do I do? When you're gone? Caleb thought about Sarah, about the lessons she'd tried to teach him, about strength that didn't come from violence. You do what I'm doing. You find people worth protecting. You build something worth defending, and you prove every single day that you're more than what people expect you to be. That sounds hard. It is, Caleb admitted. Hardest thing I've ever tried. But it's better than the alternative. Jake nodded slowly, accepting the weight of that truth. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, tending to the evening chores, each lost in their own thoughts about the future. That night, sitting around the fire, Jake asked the question Caleb had been expecting for months. Will you teach me to shoot? Really shoot, like you do. Caleb had known this was coming, had prepared himself for it, but actually hearing the words still felt like a punch to the gut. Why? Because Clay was right. You won't always be here, and when you're gone, I need to be able to protect myself. Shooting isn't the only way to protect yourself, but it's the most effective way. Jake leaned forward. I'm not asking you to turn me into Pike. I'm asking you to teach me to survive. And if I refuse, then I'll learn somewhere else, and I probably won't learn the right way. The logic was sound, even if Caleb hated it. If Jake was going to learn to shoot, and he probably should, better it came from someone who understood the weight of that knowledge. All right, Caleb said finally, but not with a pistol, with a rifle, and only for defense, only when there's no other option. I can agree to that. And one more condition. You learn discipline first, control. The mental part before the practical part. Because shooting is the easy part. Living with it after is what breaks people. Jake nodded solemnly, understanding more than most 17-year-olds would. He'd seen enough death to know it wasn't glorious or simple. When do we start? Caleb looked up at the stars, thinking about Sarah, about promises made and broken, about legacies and choices, and the thin line between protection and violence. Tomorrow, he said. We start tomorrow. The training started at dawn with no rifles involved. Instead, Caleb had Jake sitting on the ground, legs crossed, eyes closed, breathing deliberately. The kid looked confused and frustrated, which was exactly the point. This is stupid, Jake muttered after 20 minutes. I thought you were teaching me to shoot. I am. First lesson is learning to control yourself. Your breathing, your heartbeat, your fear. Caleb sat across from him, demonstrating the slow, measured breaths he'd learned decades ago. Shooting is mechanical. Any fool can pull a trigger, but hitting what you aim at when someone's shooting back, that takes discipline. Uncle Pike never... Your uncle is dead because he relied on intimidation instead of skill. Because he thought being loud and violent was the same as being dangerous. Caleb's voice was firm but not harsh. I'm not teaching you to be Pike. I'm teaching you to survive him. Big difference. So they spent the first week on breathing exercises, on meditation, on learning to quiet the mind under stress. Jake hated every minute of it, until Caleb started adding complications. Having him maintain focus while Caleb dropped things, made loud noises, threw rocks near him, but never at him. By the end of the week, Jake could sit calmly through almost anything. That's the foundation, Caleb said. Now we build on it. The second week involved basic rifle handling, not shooting, just holding the weapon properly, learning its weight, understanding how it moved and balanced. Caleb used an unloaded rifle, making Jake practice the same motion 1,000 times until it became muscle memory. Why aren't we shooting? Jake asked, frustrated again. Because shooting is the last thing you do, not the first. You need to understand the weapon before you use it. Otherwise, you're just making noise. They practiced stances, breath control while holding the rifle, sight alignment without ammunition. It was tedious and boring and exactly what Jake needed. Because the goal wasn't to create another killer. The frontier had enough of those. The goal was to create someone who could protect himself and others without becoming what Pike had been. 3 weeks in, they finally went to the range Caleb had set up on the far edge of his property. Targets at various distances, all of them marked with careful measurements. Start with the closest one, Caleb instructed. 50 yards. Take your time. Remember everything we practiced. Jake's first shot missed by 3 feet. His second missed by 2. By the 10th shot, he was starting to find the rhythm. Breath, sight, squeeze, follow through. Not good yet, but getting there. You're pulling left, Caleb observed, anticipating the recoil. Let it surprise you. That doesn't make sense. It will, when you do it right. They spent hours at the range going through boxes of ammunition. Jake's shoulders would ache, his hands would cramp, and his ears would ring despite the cotton stuffing Caleb made him use. But slowly, incrementally, he improved. More importantly, he never showed the kind of enthusiasm Pike would have encouraged. He approached shooting like a chore, necessary but not enjoyable. That was the difference Caleb was trying to instill. Violence as a last resort, not a first option. By the 4th month, Jake could hit targets at 200 yards consistently. Not brilliant, but competent, enough to defend himself if it ever came to that. That's as far as we go, Caleb said, packing away the rifle. Why? I could get better. You could teach me your long-range stuff. No, Caleb said flatly. What I know about long-range shooting is for killing, not defending. You don't need that skill, and I'm not giving it to you. Jake looked like he wanted to argue, then seemed to understand what Caleb was really saying. Some knowledge was too dangerous to share. Some abilities were better left buried. Okay, Jake said finally, but if you ever need what I can do, then something's gone seriously wrong with both our lives. Winter came early that year, blanketing the valley in snow and forcing the work to slow down. The cabin was finished enough to be warm, and Jake's bunkhouse had a stove that actually worked. They spent the cold months doing indoor work, mending tack, repairing tools, planning for spring planting. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Martha Fielding showed up with unexpected news. The valley's organizing a winter festival, she announced, shaking snow from her coat. First one in 5 years. People want to celebrate, Pike being gone, the peace we've got now. They want you both to come. Caleb's first instinct was to refuse. He'd avoided town gatherings for 12 years, and the idea of being surrounded by people celebrating his violence made his skin crawl. But Jake was looking at Martha with something like hope in his eyes. The kid had been isolated on this ranch for months, working hard, keeping his head down. He deserved a chance to be part of the community. We'll think about it, Caleb said. After Martha left, Jake turned to him with barely contained excitement. Can we go? Please? I've never been to a real festival. Pike never took you? Pike took me to saloons and gambling halls, not the same thing. Caleb studied the kid's face. Young, hopeful, desperate for normalcy. How could he deny that? How could he keep Jake prisoner to his own isolation? Yeah, Caleb said. We'll go. The festival was held in the town square on the first clear Saturday in December. Someone had strung up lights and decorations, and tables were set up with food and drinks. Musicians played on a makeshift stage, and children ran through the snow, their laughter cutting through the cold air. It was the kind of scene Sarah would have loved. Caleb and Jake arrived quietly, trying not to draw attention. But people noticed anyway. Heads turned, conversations paused. The ghost and Pike's nephew, walking into a celebration like they belonged there. Samuel Morgan was the first to approach, his limp visible but not slowing him down. Glad you came, both of you. Thanks for the invitation, Caleb said awkwardly. Food's over there, drinks by the stage, and Jake... Morgan looked at the kids seriously. There's some young folks your age over by the fire. You should introduce yourself. Jake glanced at Caleb, who nodded. The kid walked off nervously, leaving Caleb standing alone in a crowd of people who'd seen him as both savior and monster. The evening unfolded in unexpected ways. People approached Caleb not to thank him, but to talk. About crops, about weather, about normal everyday things that had nothing to do with Pike or violence or death. They were treating him like a neighbor instead of a legend, and it was both uncomfortable and strangely welcome. Across the square, Caleb could see Jake talking with some other teenagers, looking uncertain but hopeful. The kids weren't running away, weren't treating him like a pariah. They were just talking, laughing, being young people on a cold winter night. He's doing well, Sheriff Boone said, appearing beside Caleb with 2 cups of hot cider. The kid, you've done good by him. We'll see. Still early. It's been 6 months. If he was going to turn out like Pike, we'd know by now. Boone handed Caleb one of the cups. You gave him a chance. That's more than most would have done. Sarah would have done the same. Yeah, she would have. But she's not here. You are. And you're trying to be what she wanted you to be. Boone sipped his cider. That counts for something. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the edge of the square. Caleb's hand went instinctively toward his hip, where his pistol would have been if he'd brought it, which he hadn't because Sarah always said weapons at celebrations were asking for trouble. But it wasn't violence. It was a young woman who'd fallen on the ice, and Jake rushing over to help her up. He said something that made her laugh, and she brushed snow from her dress while talking to him with a smile that suggested genuine interest. "That's Emma Patterson," Boone said. "The doctor's daughter. Good kid. Smart." Caleb watched Jake interact with her. Awkward but kind, clearly smitten but respectful. Normal teenage behavior, the kind Pike would have mocked as weakness. "He's got a chance," Caleb said quietly. "A real chance to be something different." "So do you." The words hung in the cold air. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to explain that he was too old, too broken, too steeped in violence to be anything other than what he was. But watching Jake laugh with Emma, watching the Valley celebrate peace, he wondered if maybe Boone was right. Maybe everyone got a second chance if they were willing to take it. The winter passed into spring, and with it came both growth and challenges. Jake continued working the ranch, but he also started spending time in town, helping at the general store, learning carpentry from Samuel Morgan, courting Emma Patterson with teenage enthusiasm. Caleb watched it all with mixed emotions. Pride at seeing Jake integrate into the community, fear that it wouldn't last, and underneath it all, a growing awareness that the kid didn't need him anymore. Not in the same way, at least. "I've been thinking," Jake said one evening in early April, "about the future." They were sitting on the porch of the completed cabin, watching sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and red. Peaceful. The kind of moment Caleb had forgotten was possible. "What about it?" "Samuel says I've got talent for woodworking. Says he'd take me on as an apprentice if I wanted." Jake hesitated. "And Emma, she's going to school in the fall, studying to be a teacher. She asked if I'd wait for her." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. Not sadness exactly, but recognition that change was coming whether he was ready or not. "What do you want to do?" "I want to stay. In the valley, I mean. Build a life here." Jake looked at Caleb. "But I don't want to abandon you either. After everything you've done..." "Stop! You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything. You gave me a chance when everyone else wanted me dead or gone. You taught me I could be more than Pike's legacy. And now you're proving it. That's not abandoning me, Jake. That's succeeding." They sat in silence for a while, both understanding that this was a pivot point. Jake was growing up, growing beyond the scared kid who'd shown up 6 months ago. And Caleb had to let him. "So I can take the apprenticeship?" Jake asked. "On one condition, you come back for Sunday dinner, keep me updated, don't become a stranger." Jake smiled, relieved. "Deal." The transition wasn't immediate. Jake moved into a room above Samuel Morgan's workshop, but continued helping at the ranch on weekends. He learned carpentry with the same focus Caleb had taught him, approaching the craft with patience and discipline. Emma Patterson became a regular presence at Sunday dinners, sitting beside Jake and engaging Caleb in conversations about books and ideas that reminded him painfully of Sarah. The girl was smart, kind, and saw something in Jake beyond his uncle's shadow. "She's good for him," Martha Fielding observed during one of her visits. "Keeps him grounded, gives him something to work toward." "Yeah," Caleb agreed. "She does." "And what about you? What are you working toward?" The question caught him off guard. For months, his entire purpose had been rehabilitating Jake, proving the kid could be more than Pike's nephew. But now that Jake was succeeding, what was left? "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "Haven't thought that far ahead." "Maybe you should. You're only 52, got a lot of years left if you don't waste them." She was right, but Caleb didn't know what to do with that truth. He'd spent 12 years in stasis, then 6 months focused on Jake. The idea of building something for himself, not for Sarah's memory, not for someone else, felt foreign. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Sheriff Boone showed up one afternoon with a proposal. The territorial governor is looking for experienced men to help train new lawmen, people who know the frontier, who've seen real violence and know how to handle it without becoming it. "You're asking me to train lawmen?" "I'm asking you to pass on what you know to people who'll use it right. Teach them discipline, control, the difference between protection and revenge." Boone leaned forward. "You did it with Jake. You could do it with others." "I'm not a teacher." You are, though. You just don't realize it. That kid went from being Pike's shadow to being a respected member of this community. That didn't happen by accident. Caleb thought about it, the idea of taking what Sarah had taught him and passing it forward. Not the violence itself, but the discipline that prevented violence from consuming you, the control that separated soldiers from murderers. I need time to think about it, Caleb said. Take all the time you need. Job will be there when you're ready. That night, Caleb pulled out the journal he'd kept during his army days, the one filled with calculations and targets and cold mathematical assessments of death. He'd been planning to burn it, to destroy the last evidence of what he'd been. Instead, he started writing new entries. Not about killing, but about teaching, about discipline and control, about the mental frameworks that kept violence contained. If he was going to do this, if he was going to train the next generation of lawmen, he needed to be clear about what he was passing on and what he was burying forever. 2 months later, Caleb accepted the position. He would spend part of each year at the Territorial Training Center, teaching young lawmen the hard lessons he'd learned. The rest of the time, he'd maintain the ranch, live quietly, and continue being part of the Valley community. It wasn't the life Sarah had envisioned for him. That life had burned down with the cabin, but it was something new, something that honored her memory while acknowledging what he actually was. A man who knew violence intimately and had learned to control it instead of being controlled by it. The first class of students was nervous around him. They'd heard the stories, the ghost who'd killed Pike's entire gang single-handedly, the frontier legend who'd vanished for 12 years. They expected someone terrifying. What they got was a quiet, methodical teacher who emphasized mental discipline over marksmanship, who made them sit in silence for hours before ever touching a weapon, who taught them that the best gunfight was the one you avoided. Violence is easy, Caleb told them on the first day. Any fool can pull a trigger. What's hard is knowing when not to pull it, knowing when to walk away, knowing how to resolve a situation without adding to the body count. One student raised his hand. But what if they don't give you a choice? What if it's you or them? Then you do what you have to do. But you do it with clarity, not anger, with necessity, not pleasure. And you carry it afterward because that weight is what keeps you human. Caleb looked at each of them. The moment killing becomes easy is the moment you lose something you can't get back. The training was intensive. Mental discipline, physical conditioning, scenario work that emphasized de-escalation. And yes, shooting, but always as a last resort, always with the understanding that every bullet had a cost. By the end of the first session, several students had washed out, too impatient, too eager for violence, too much like Pike. But the ones who remained understood what Caleb was teaching, that being dangerous wasn't the same as being violent, that real strength came from control, not chaos. It was during his second year of teaching that Caleb received word. Jake was getting married. The wedding took place on a warm Saturday in June, with the entire valley in attendance. Emma wore a simple white dress, and Jake stood beside her in a suit that Samuel Morgan had helped him buy, looking nervous and happy and completely unlike the scared kid who'd shown up at Caleb's burned ranch 2 years ago. Caleb sat in the front row, a position of honor that still felt uncomfortable, and watched Jake make vows about building a life together, about protecting and cherishing, about being more than what the world expected. When Jake said, "I do," his voice was steady and sure, and Caleb felt something release in his chest. The kid had made it, had outrun Pike's shadow, had become his own person. After the ceremony, during the celebration, Jake found Caleb standing alone near the edge of the gathering. "Thank you," Jake said simply, "for everything. For believing I could be more than Pike's nephew. You did that yourself. I just gave you space to figure it out. No. You gave me an example, showed me what it looked like to choose something different, even when violence was easier." Jake paused. "I'm going to name my first kid after you, if that's okay." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "That's not necessary. It's not about necessary. It's about honoring the man who saved my life by teaching me how to live it." Later, as the celebration wound down and the sun set over the valley, Sheriff Boone found Caleb again. "You did good," Boone said. "With Jake, with the training program, with all of it. Just trying to make up for the past." "That's where you're wrong. You're not making up for anything. You're building something new." Boone gestured at the celebration, at Jake laughing with his new wife, at the valley that had come together in peace. This is what Sarah wanted, isn't it? For you to be part of something bigger than violence? Caleb thought about Sarah, about the woman who'd seen past his reputation, who'd believed he could be more than what the army had made him. She'd been right, even if it had taken him 20 years to prove it. Yeah, Caleb said. This is what she wanted. The years that followed weren't perfect. There were setbacks and struggles, moments when Caleb wondered if he was fooling himself about being better. The nightmares never fully stopped. The weight of 47 confirmed kills never completely lifted. Some things you carried forever. But there were also victories. Students who graduated from his program and became good lawmen, firm but fair, dangerous but controlled. Jake and Emma's first child, a boy they named Caleb after the man who'd changed Jake's life. The ranch that continued to be productive, proof that something could grow from burned ground. And slowly, painfully, Caleb learned to be part of a community again, to accept help when offered, to let people see him as more than the ghost, to be human in all its messy, complicated, imperfect reality. 5 years after Pike's death, Caleb stood on his porch watching the sunrise and realized something had changed. The rifle, the massive sharps that had defined so much of his life, was still in the cabin, still maintained, still ready if needed. But he hadn't touched it in months. Didn't think about it daily. Didn't define himself by it anymore. He was Caleb Hale, rancher and teacher, a man with a past he couldn't change and a future he was actively building. Not the ghost, not the legend, just a person trying to be better than what circumstances had made him. Martha Fielding's grandchildren played in his yard sometimes, chasing chickens and climbing trees. Jake brought his family for Sunday dinners, and young Caleb, barely 3 years old, called him Papa Hale with unself-conscious affection. The valley had accepted him not as a necessary evil, but as a neighbor, a friend, someone who'd proven through years of quiet consistency that change was possible. One evening, as he sat on the porch with the sunset painting the sky in familiar colors, Jake joined him with 2 cups of coffee. Emma wants to know if you'll teach at the new school, Jake said. Basic reading and writing for the older kids who never learned. She says you're patient, clear, good at breaking complex things down. I'm not a school teacher. You're a teacher, just happens to be the kind who teaches deadly skills. This is just a different application. Caleb smiled despite himself. When did you get so wise? I learned from the best. Jake sipped his coffee. So will you do it? Teach at the school? Caleb thought about it. About Sarah, who'd valued education above almost everything. About the chance to pass on something that had nothing to do with violence. About continuing to prove he was more than the sum of his kills. Yeah, he said, I'll do it. Years later, when people told stories about the valley's history, they talked about the dark time when Pike Mercer terrorized families and stole land. They talked about the ghost who'd emerged from isolation to stop him. They talked about Miller's Canyon and the impossible shots and the legend that had built up around Caleb Hale. But the people who actually knew Caleb, the students he'd trained, the children he'd taught to read, the young man he'd saved from his uncle's legacy, they told different stories. They talked about discipline and patience, about the importance of choosing control over chaos, about how strength wasn't measured by how many men you could kill, but by how many you could save. They talked about a man who'd been a weapon and chose to become something more, and in doing so, proved that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future that honored what you'd learned without being imprisoned by what you'd done. Caleb never fully escaped his history. The nightmares persisted, though less frequently. The weight remained, though easier to carry. He was still the man who'd killed 47 people as a soldier and 13 more as a rancher. Those bodies didn't disappear just because he'd spent years teaching and building and trying to be better. But he was also the man who'd given Jake Mercer a future, who'd trained a generation of lawmen to use violence as a last resort, who'd helped children learn to read and ranchers mend fences and a community heal from trauma. Both versions were true. Both versions mattered. The ghost and the teacher. The killer and the mentor. The man Sarah had loved and the man he'd become after losing her. On his last day of teaching at the Territorial Training Center, Caleb stood before his final class and tried to sum up everything he'd learned in 50-plus years of violence and peace. You're going to face hard choices, he told them. Situations where there's no good answer, only less bad ones. Times when you'll have to use violence to protect people who'll never know your name. That's the job. That's what you signed up for. He paused, looking at each young face in turn. But here's what I learned the hard way. Violence changes you. Every time you pull that trigger, every time you take a life, something inside shifts. You can't avoid it, can't prevent it, but you can choose what that change makes you. It can make you a monster, someone who kills easily and feels nothing. That's the path Pike Mercer took. That's where most outlaws end up. Or it can make you careful, deliberate, someone who understands the weight of what they're capable of and carries it with humility instead of pride. That's harder. That's what I'm asking you to be. Because the world doesn't need more ghosts. It needs more people willing to stand between innocence and violence. More people who know how to fight but choose not to unless there's no other option. More people who understand that real strength is measured by restraint, not body count. One student raised his hand. What if we fail? What if we become the thing we're fighting against? Then you start over. You acknowledge it. You try to be better tomorrow than you were today. That's all any of us can do. Caleb picked up his hat, preparing to leave. I was a weapon for most of my life. Took me until I was 50 to figure out I could be something else. Don't waste as much time as I did. He walked out of the training center for the last time, leaving behind another generation of young lawmen who would carry his lessons into the frontier. Some would succeed, some would fail. All of them would face choices that would define who they became, just like he had, just like everyone did. The ride back to the valley was peaceful. Spring was turning into summer, and the land was green with new growth. Caleb took his time, letting his horse set the pace, in no hurry to arrive. He'd spent enough of his life rushing toward things, toward targets, toward violence, toward endings. Now he could afford to move slowly, to appreciate what remained. He reached his ranch at sunset, the golden light making everything look softer than it was. The cabin stood solid and real, rebuilt from ashes into something stronger. Smoke rose from Jake's chimney half a mile down the valley, the house Jake had built himself, where he lived with Emma and their 3 children. 3 generations, Caleb thought. Sarah would have loved seeing this, would have loved knowing that her belief in second chances had rippled forward to touch people she'd never met. He unsaddled his horse and fed it, then stood in his yard looking at everything he'd built. Not just the physical structures, but the relationships, the community, the future that existed because he'd chosen control over chaos. It wasn't perfect. He wasn't perfect. The valley still had problems, still had people who struggled and suffered and made bad choices. That was life. Messy and complicated and never quite what you expected. But it was better than the alternative. Better than isolation and violence and the cold mathematics of death that had defined his youth. As the last light faded and stars began to appear, Caleb heard footsteps approaching. Jake, carrying young Caleb on his shoulders, with Emma and their 2 daughters trailing behind. "Thought we'd welcome you home," Jake said. Kids wanted to see Papa Hale. The children rushed forward, chattering about their day, about things that seemed impossibly important to them, and probably were. Caleb listened and nodded and let himself be part of their world, noisy and chaotic and full of life. This was what he'd fought for, he realized. Not the valley specifically, not this exact configuration of people and places, but the possibility of it, the chance for children to grow up safe, for young men to become more than their worst impulses, for broken people to rebuild, for ghosts to become human again. Later, after Jake's family had gone home and Caleb sat alone by his fire, he pulled out the photograph of Sarah. The edges were worn from years of handling, the image faded but still clear enough to see her smile. "I did it," he told her image. "Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but I became something closer to what you believed I could be." The photograph didn't answer. Dead people never did. But somewhere in his memory, he could hear her voice. "I always knew you would. You just had to believe it yourself." Caleb set the photograph on the mantel where it belonged, not hidden away, not buried with his past, but present and visible. A reminder of who he'd been, who he'd lost, and who he'd chosen to become. The rifle stayed in its case in the back room. Still there, still ready if needed. But no longer the first thing he thought about when danger appeared. No longer the defining feature of his existence. Just a tool, nothing more, nothing less. And that, finally, was the difference. The fire burned down to embers. Caleb sat watching the coals glow, thinking about the long road from soldier to hermit to ghost to teacher, about Pike and Jake and Sarah and all the people whose lives had intersected with his own, about violence and peace and the razor-thin line between them, about how easy it was to become a monster and how hard it was to become anything else, but also about how worth it that struggle was, how the hard choice was usually the right one, how redemption wasn't a destination, but a direction you chose every single day. Tomorrow he'd wake early and start working on the new fence line, would help Samuel with some carpentry, would meet with Emma about the curriculum for the school, would live his life quietly, consistently, proving through actions instead of words that change was possible, that people could be more than their worst moments, that ghosts could lay down their weapons and still be strong. That was the lesson he'd learned, the one he'd pass on to anyone willing to listen. Not that violence was never necessary. Sometimes it was. Not that the past disappeared. It never did. But that you could carry your history without letting it define your future. Could acknowledge what you'd been without remaining trapped there forever. The valley slept around him, peaceful, safe, protected by people who understood that the best defense was a community that took care of its own. Caleb Hale sat in the darkness, a man who'd been a weapon and chosen to become a builder, who'd killed when necessary and taught peace when possible, who'd lost everything and found something new in the ashes, who'd been a ghost and become human again. And that, finally, was enough.